Most of you know a little bit about my past history in running, but it was in the early 1970s that I got frustrated. Matter of fact, it was the wage and price controls that Nixon put on that really aggravated me, and I think most of you would remember those times. And we do recall also that even when wage and price controls were removed, for some reason, they had price controls on doctors longer than anybody else, if you recall. Also, when there was a draft, do you remember? They always had a draft on doctors longer than anybody else. If you weren't a doctor, you weren't supposed to serve after you were 30 or something, but a doctor could serve until they were 45 under coercion. So we are rather unique individuals, and sometimes we're not more equal than the others. Sometimes we're less equal than those other people. But it was the frustration of the early 70s that motivated me to run. And I had run in 1974, and that was a year when absolutely nobody knew what I was doing. I was running against a Democratic incumbent who never had a serious opponent. And it was a district that was strongly Democratic, and there was very little chance of being elected. But Steve, even under those circumstances, came and campaigned for me. But when I first announced for running for Congress, I told Carol about it, and she says, "What in the world would you want to do this for?" She said, "This could be very dangerous." And I said, "How could running for Congress be dangerous? I know I'm worried about conditions, but it's not dangerous running for Congress. This is still America." She said, "Well, the whole thing is," she says, "you might get elected." But I tried to convince her that she was absolutely wrong, because how would they elect myself, somebody like myself who believed in such limited government? I don't believe that, if you do enforce the 9th and 10th Amendment, we would be getting rid of about 80 or 90% of what we have in Washington. For the 10th Amendment movement, great. And this certainly was a condition that we had to be concerned about being elected. And I was surprised, and I was pleased, and I was happy that I could serve. And I did serve 4 terms in Washington. And it wasn't out of frustration or exasperation about what happened during that time that I decided to leave. But the truth is I was at an age and at a point in my life where I never wanted to give up medicine. And I decided to go back in order to practice some medicine again. And even while I was in Washington, I did go home on weekends, and I was able to practice some medicine. Unfortunately, you cannot be a citizen politician in the sense that it was meant to be, because when I went back, the most I could do is assist on surgery and see some patients on the weekend. But in other words, I did not lose total contact with my medical practice. But after I went back, I have been practicing OBGYN since, and have done surgery this week, and have continued to stay in medicine. Now, this sounds like maybe it's trying to do too many things at one time, but the way I feel is that the closer you are to your profession and to the people at home, the better you can represent people in Washington. And I've been back for 10 years. I've kept up with an educational foundation, which I thought was very important, because long term, politicians like myself and others, we really don't solve the problems. It will be more the workings of the speaker that you have following me, the type of work that he does is more important than what the politicians do. But ultimately, we have to change the intellectual environment of the country and the beliefs of the people in order to have a change in government. And matter of fact, that's the area where I'm most optimistic, because I believe there have been some very, very positive changes in the country. I think this is being reflected in the changes that we saw in the Congress last year, and we should be pleased with that. But where I'm not so pleased is what's happening in Washington. So far, we have not seen a reversal. Conditions tend to still be quite difficult, and we have a ways to go. I had been a strong supporter of Ronald Reagan, supported him in '76 as well as 1980, and yet I wasn't overly enthralled with the reversal of the spending programs of the 1980s. The national debt tripled in the 8 years Reagan was there, so there was something wrong with that. And I recall one story that I thought might tell us a little bit about why that happened, is that when Reagan first took over, Lynn Nofziger called up the hiring people with the Reagan administration and said, I had so-and-so, and I need to get him a job. The guy at the other end of the phone said, well, he says, that's all right, but this guy doesn't know anything. He's totally incompetent. And Nofziger said, he said, that may be the case, but he says, up right now, he says, it's our turn for our incompetence to run this government. So sometimes I think maybe some incompetents still are operating up in Washington, and hopefully we will see a change. Early in our debate, right after Reagan was elected, there was a proposal came up on the House floor rather quickly, and one of the liberals got up and said, well, if you guys are going to slash all this welfare spending for the poor, we're going to slash welfare for the rich. And Dick Obey, I think it was, Obey got up and said, well, we're going to slash export-import bank money. And that was supposed to be, the subsidies to the rich. And all of a sudden, it was overwhelmingly endorsed, and I was encouraged. I thought, isn't this wonderful? They're going to cut across the board, welfare for everybody. And that afternoon, they interviewed some lobbyists from Lockheed and some other big companies in the Washington Post. And they said, boy, you guys really took a lump today. You guys are going to lose. Look at this. They're slashing your programs. And the lobbyists, in a very cocky manner, said, that's no big deal. We welcome the opportunity. We're going to show them what kind of clout we have in this town. And that night, the lobbyists, the lobbyists for the businessmen called the Republicans, the lobbyists for the labor unions called the Democrats. That same vote came up the next day, and 100 members of Congress reversed their vote. Men of integrity. It took them a whole 24 hours to reverse it. About that time, I realized that not much would happen. When they interviewed one of the boll weevils, one of the conservative Democrats from Louisiana, and they said, who had switched his vote, they said, how come you switched? He says, I just went with the best deal. Whoever offered me, he said, I went with the best deal. And he was willing, the amazing thing is he was willing to admit this to a Washington Post reporter. I mean, this was the moral attitude a person has, that he doesn't think this is unacceptable. And it must not be, because since then he's been promoted to be senator from Louisiana. And they said, well, does that mean then that your vote is for sale? And he stopped for a minute and thought, he says, no, but it's for rent. So there's a lot of votes for rent and for sale up here, and that attitude has to change. It is going to change. But I am quite concerned that it will not change without some serious, serious problems economically. We have spent beyond our means, and we have borrowed beyond our means. We have a currency that has been bearing the burden of this. And internationally and financially speaking, we have a long way to go before we will have stable, healthy currencies throughout the world, or a sound dollar once again. The welfare state is coming to an end. And I think that's what the message is, and this is why so many people are frustrated and upset today, and yet they don't know exactly why. They're striking out. They think that a Ross Perot or a Colin Powell will solve the problems. Believe me, there's no answers there for the economic problems we face today. We have serious problems that will only be solved by restoring a free market economy and a sound currency, and restoring liberty to all of us. The chances of that happening soon are not likely. We are seeing these changes where we have more members of Congress than ever before, but we still have a lot of spending. One subject, of course, we've all been interested in and watching has been this Medicare-Medicaid debate. The figures are just not there. We cannot continue not only the Medicare system, but the Social Security system itself. There's a figure now that shows that if Republicans get all their cuts, and that has to be a terrible word because there are no cuts. Matter of fact, they counteract the Democrat argument. Of course we're not cutting anything, so we shouldn't even consider it a cut. I happen to think we ought to consider cuts. You know, real cuts. But if the Republican program gets passed, the average individual right now receives $4,600 from Medicare per year. If they pass all the cuts, which they won't because of the politics of it all, in the year 2002, the spending will be $6,700. It's going up nearly 50% if we get the cuts. And the demagoguery of the opposition to the Republican token proposals is so great, and the media emphasis is so strong, I don't think we should expect that to happen. I think we are going to continue on our spendthrift ways, and this whole crisis will be resolved with a monetary and financial crisis. We know as physicians that we're facing a crisis, and this cannot continue. And I have a strong opinion about why this is happening. Unfortunately, our leadership in the, and I should qualify that because that is not true of this group, the leadership of government, or of medicine in this country, the AMA, has not ever been able to provide the alternative to government-run medicine. They've been part of the problem. Today we see some legislation passing through the House and the Senate, and your speaker tonight really will be able to give you really good insight. If you have not seen Stan Evans's article in Human Events this week, this is really an eye-opener as to what is happening, that there really aren't any changes, and the main reason is they do not deal with this on principle. The basic free market libertarian principle is that government has no moral authority to use coercion to bring about economic changes. And yet we have gone for years as conservatives and as Republicans and fought the battles with the liberal big spenders and saying, well, what we need is a little less rapid trend toward socialism. What we want is not a $28 billion food stamp program. We want a $27 billion food stamp program. And what we have done is anybody who argues in those terms have conceded the moral argument that the government has this authority. And under our Constitution, under common moral decency, and under economic rules of the free market, there should be none of that. And we should always approach them by saying, this program should not exist, it should be abolished, it's morally not acceptable, it's not authorized in the Constitution, and argue from that viewpoint. But for years we have conceded this fight, and until we make this a moral argument rather than an argument in arithmetic, we cannot win. This is not a budgetary battle. This is a moral and a philosophic battle that we must face. We've talked a whole lot recently about taxes. Everybody's interested in the new tax proposals. They talk about a flat tax rate, and they talk about the sales tax. And I've talked about that for years. Matter of fact, I get a bit of sense of pleasure out of the fact that back in the old days, Steve and a few others of us would sign on and actually say, we're for abolishing the IRS. Of course, what they didn't realize, we were willing to abolish most of the government too. But now, we even have the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee bold enough to say, well, we ought to get rid of the IRS. But they're missing one point. They're talking about tinkering with the tax code. They're talking about getting rid of the IRS and having a sales tax. You know what kind of sales tax you really need if you needed the revenues to pay for the bills? Probably 38%. Some people say higher than that. And you'd have to have a collection agency out there doing it. And I have participated in the debate of the flat tax rate. And I can remember very clearly in the early 1980s, Murray Rothbard called me up. He says, Ron, don't be for the flat tax rate. He says, by the time they work that flat tax over, he says they're going to take away deductions, they're going to raise the base, and they're going to collect more revenues. And really, the '86 tax bill was the consequence, and that keeps coming back. Murray was right. Murray was right on that we don't need a flat tax. My original flat tax was a little more simple than that. Mine was the maximum tax of any government agency ought to be 10%. If the church only asks for 10%, the government should never get more than that. 10% would be the top limit. Collecting revenues is not the problem. They're collecting too much, they still have too much deficits, and they're still looking for more. The problem is spending. The problem is spending, so I don't even like the debate that's going on now between Republican leadership here and Republican leadership here, pretending it's a big contest between the sales tax and the flat tax. The worst thing that could happen in this country, maybe not the worst, there could be some benefits if you had only the sales tax, because the market would work in that regard too as to who would be really paying. But if you had a sales tax that was painless and generated the revenues to pay for the government we have, it wouldn't necessarily be good, it'd be bad. Because you lose twice. First, they take your money, that's the first loss, and the second time is when they spend it. All they're going to do is send more regulators out. So the regulations are every bit as onerous as the removal of your spending power by taxing you. So it isn't the revenue problem. I would do anything conceivable to get rid of the power of the income tax. I would support a system that would shake them up a little bit. But the only thing that's going to solve our problems will ultimately be to repeal the notion and get rid of the ideas that stand behind the moral authority of a police state that is used to enforce the welfare state. Along with this, one that believes in the Constitution strongly and following it in foreign policy, I've taken somewhat different position than others have on the Republican side. To me, the power of our government should be limited to the protection of our liberty and not to meddle in the affairs of other nations. And this means that there's really no place for outfits like for the United Nations and for what's going on in Bosnia. Do you realize that the debate is essentially over as far as the 25,000 troops going into Bosnia? This is, you know, we hear token questions asked, but they're not serious questions. They're not serious questions at all. It's just sort of politicizing and demagoguing the issue because the troops will go. The leadership on both sides over there endorses internationalism and the power of the United Nations. Right now, one of our most serious problems is the question of national sovereignty. We read about this, and sometimes they would like to make us believe that those of us who talk about it have to be some type of conspiratorial nuts to believe that this is a problem. But remember, for a year now, we read about and heard about stories about foreign troops and trucks and training in this country, and it was denied and said, no, this isn't possible. Are there black helicopters? And I say, that sounds like crazy stuff I don't want to listen to because I haven't seen the evidence. Yeah, what happened a couple of months ago? Ted Koppel has a program on showing what's happening at Fort Polk in Louisiana, where thousands of troops are down there training for peacekeeping missions. I heard one story, and I hope it's wrong, because if it's true, it's very, very serious. It's going to occur next year. And it comes from a source that generally is written off by the conventional media, but most of the time they're right. And the story is that 9,000 UN troops could be used to police the Olympics next year in Atlanta. Now, that is hard for me to believe. I don't want to believe it, and I don't believe it for sure now, but those who have said these things have generally been right so often in some other predictions they've made. But this whole idea of national sovereignty, I've been concerned about some of the trade agreements, not because I don't believe in the free market and free trade, because I am consistent with the Austrian free market economics, and I believe in it. I do not believe that we would suffer under free trade, but I do not believe in the managed trade under the international treaties where it takes 20,000 pages to design a program of free trade such as we've had under GATT and NAFTA. So, not too long ago, I had an opportunity to meet with a gentleman by the name of Michael New. Does anybody know Michael New's name? Michael New is a young man from the Houston area, and he's stationed in Germany. Now he is a lonely, lonely person, and I can empathize a whole lot with what he's going through, because just this week he was asked to stand up and report himself with 600 buddies of his in Germany to report to be ready to go to Macedonia. The one request that he could not accept was putting on the UN uniform. He has now been taken out. He may be processed out of the service. He may be court-martialed, but he had to appear with 600 other soldiers who stood up and put the uniform on, and he stood by himself. And believe me, there's nobody can comprehend just quite what that means to stand alone like that. But there's an interesting story about Michael New. I was fascinated and somewhat pleased when I had breakfast with him a couple of weeks ago. Carol and I had breakfast with him and his father. And when they came in and sat down, they came out and they took out my little booklet called Freedom Under Siege. And it was well written and well underlined, and they asked me to sign that book because they had read it thoroughly. And not only that, Michael New was homeschooled. He was not brought up with the intimidation and indoctrination of the public school system, and therefore he had the mental and the moral capacity to stand up against the United Nations. But he still has, you know, a long way to go, and we will be hearing more of that story. But this whole idea and notion and concern that we have for national sovereignty exists on a day-to-day basis. And as we talk about tokenism of taking a few government grants, which are illegal to begin with, and passing them back to the states and claiming this is a move toward freedom and individual liberty, at the same time we see other things moving along toward internationalism. The financial structure has been internationalized for decades, ever since we've had the IMF and the World Bank. And now since they've had the World Trade Organization, the claim is that we've had the three legs of the New World Order put in place. So those are serious problems, but ultimately it boils down to one thing, and that is our concern and our respect for individual liberty. The basic question that we have not yet asked, that we must ask if we expect to get our country on the right course, and that is, what should the role of government be in a free society? If we can't ask that question, we can't get the answer. We can't solve our problems with a budgetary conference. We cannot negotiate with some little program and have a compromise between a $50 billion program with a $45 billion program. That will not do it. We must once again ask the question that the founders of this country asked, and they said, we don't want an oppressive government, we don't want a police state, we don't want a military state, and that is what we're moving toward. We are now seeing a time where 10% of all our police officers in this country are federal policemen. We're moving a time when every time there's an uprising, they want to pass another piece of federal legislation to crack down on the liberties of individuals. But we must ask, what should the role of government be? And if you approach this from a moral viewpoint, it should be very limited. The purpose of government is to protect our liberty and to protect our national defense, and that's it. It should be no more complicated than that. And yet today we have a massive government in Washington telling us every single thing we can do, hire and fire. I mean, how many of us expected, I mean, the AAPS has been around for a good many years, but how many would have predicted that we would have OSHA inspectors in our office? And how many of us are really rebelling against it? It is a real tragedy of what's happening, that today, literally, if the OSHA inspector comes to my office, and I hope there are no spies here, because they could wipe me out with the fines that they would give me, and they could imprison me for practicing medicine the way I see fit, and I didn't follow some bureaucrat's rules up from Washington. And yet today, the solution that they're providing for us after this revolution of last year is to say that what we need is the government orchestrating more managed care. To me, there's only one managed care that is reasonable. Far from perfect, but the best. And that is the managed care that comes between physician and patient and nobody else. Bastiat said, when plunder has become a way of life for a group of people living together in society, they create for themselves, in the course of time, a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. And that's where we are. We have a legal system and a moral system that glorifies plunder. Plunder is a great term. It's not welfare. It's not, socialism. It's plunder. It's theft, and it's based on an immoral principle of the use of violence. Because everything they do and say, and although they're coming to our office, the real threat is a gun. And they come with the threat of a gun, and they tell us if we don't obey and follow the rules, they will use this gun to take our money and take our wealth and take our means of making a living and actually threat us bodily harm if we do not do it. It's plunder and it's theft, and there is a lot of crime in this country. And crime is probably one of the biggest issues even in the campaign that I'm now running. Crime is. But you know what? If you measured it in terms of dollars and threats and guns and violence, the government is the biggest criminal today. We know what our problems are, and we really should know what the solution is. I have not given up on political action, and I will continue to fight these battles with political action, and I actually believe there's a very good chance that I can be returned to Congress. And my wife wants to know, why in the world would I want to do something like that? And one of the healthiest answers for that is, I'm not all that anxious to go over there one more time, because I don't like the atmosphere, but it also is the attitude is necessary to be vigilant about what is happening, whether it's the right side of the aisle, the left side of the aisle, what they are doing to our liberties, and being able to define in concise principle what we believe in. Today we are in a better shape than we were when I first went. We were very lonely back in the days when we might be able to get 5 of us to stand up and vote to abolish the IRS. Today there's 100 members of the Constitutional Caucus. There's a bill floating around introduced by Shattuck from Arizona that if it were passed it would be wonderful. It says that nobody can introduce legislation unless they cite that provision in the Constitution that authorizes what they're doing. That probably, in a legislative sense, that's probably one of the most important pieces of legislation that could be passed. I hope I am there to help do it. And thank you very much.